Ag and tears. Let me start that again.
Go for it. Just continue.
Hey, fellow G and tears, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist.
No such thing as mistakes. We just roll.
Yes. Everything is destined. Even my verbal flub ups.
Yeah.
On the fucking tagline of this thing.
That you made.
That I've said a gazillion fucking times.
Yeah.
All right. So good times. It's all about the professionalism.
That's it.
So, okay. So we're doing this thing on what's sometimes called the mind only school, sometimes called the yogic experience school. And we're having a chat about it. I was thinking about, Daniel, it's not the kind of thing you can do full justice to in the amount of time we'll be able to do it, but it's a different way of thinking about the world. And it's a different kind of spiritual teaching. And it's cool to talk about. It was initially driven by the idea of talking about ego in this sense of like individual identity that you have to protect or something like that, because that was a hot topic. And Daniel had this whole idea of an existential guardian operating system.
Yeah.
So we did that. But it led naturally into this discussion of this other thing. And we got into this point of really talking about what the connection is between the mind and the external world. So we'll solve that in the next 45 minutes.
No problem.
Not.
Done.
It's funny as my daughter, it's been very synchronistic lately. It's been kind of nice. Lots of little synchronistic stuff. Actually, I have, reaching back. I found this book actually on sale in the local bookstore, and I was doing a little prep with it.
Synchronicity.
Carl Jung synchronicity.
Carl Jung.
It's like that synchronicity. It's so synchronistic that the actual book is there. I found it like a couple of weekends ago. I had a copy back in the day, and I had lent it to a student, grad student, gone. So I've never lent a book to a grad student that hasn't disappeared.
Naughty.
Yep, gone. I must have done the same thing to people too, so it's okay. Anyways, my daughter, speaking of synchronicities, has to do this class at for her undergrad, and it's supposed to be about she could either choose to do an in-class exam, and she was asking me about should she do the in-class exam, which sounds really hard. So I was like, no, write the paper. But the paper's on the problem of consciousness and what's the nature of like consciousness in the brain. I was like, holy shit, we're doing an episode on this exactly like tomorrow. So this is our nicely synchronistic. Thank you, Uncle Carl.
Thanks, Uncle Carl.
Lifetime and connection to episodes. All right, so here's what they say in this yoga experience school brief version. They talk about these three natures, and I don't think I got your vibe on this, Daniel, and I am curious to see what you think, especially since you're coming out of retreat and in a very profound state of mind. So they talk about the idea of the dependent nature, and this is the idea that there's this sort of causal flow that's happening. There's like a kind of a karmic, energetic, cosmic flow that's happening, and all these experiences are constantly happening to all of us, right? And they're all flitting by. And in our way of looking at this from our own point of view, some of these things are experienced as external things, sensory experiences from the world around us that we take in through the gates of our senses. I like to use the word gates. Nice word. So gates of the senses come in. Some of them are experienced as more internal, as in the flow of our thoughts and feelings, our deeper drives and motivations, those kinds of internal things that we've been talking about a lot lately.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of karmic energetic flow happening is the idea. And this is what they call the dependent nature, right? It depends on causes and conditions, I think is the idea. So they say dependent. Buddhists like to talk that way. So, that makes sense that they would say that. But anyways, I don't think you have to be Buddhist to get this idea, obviously. No. There's a flow of experience. Some of it's sensory, some of it's internal. Some of it's how our internal reacts to our sensory and vice versa. And as we've been talking about, these things influence one another,
Yeah.
So this is the whole thing. You're in love and you're in love with everything. You feel like you're in love and like you love the whole world. Or you were talking about it in the retreat, Daniel. You're so full of the feeling of this retreat, you kind of like feel like you could just embrace the whole world, right? You feel this expansive quality of like, I love everything. I love this whole planet, right? Yeah. So these things are affecting one another. Okay, so that's the dependent nature, and then they have this thing they call the imputed nature. This is where this gets pretty deep in this yogic experience thing. Because I think by calling it yoga experience, they mean that this is what you can experience through the process of your spiritual training and practice and meditation and all this kind of stuff.
But
or as you start to self-reflect on these things.
But keeping in mind that the word yoga in this sense is not in reference to bendy, stretchy, right?
Yeah.
It's not. We're not talking about downward dog or warriors, right?
Yeah, warrior pose. Yeah.
Yeah. In this case, yoga meaning like practice or the coming together of the sort of unification of two different things at once, right?
And as you were talking about your retreat, obviously the physical aspects of yoga can be a part of this.
Yeah.
It can be part of that training.
Yeah.
But now you're talking about something else on top of that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Like physical yoga is nice. It does help to clear the channels and rid the body of some anxiousness or whatever, some physical combination of discomforted feelings, for sure, which is why it's really nice. And it does some strengthening and whatever, health wise. But I think the deeper part is like that's external working internal. And what we're moving, more in this conversation is internal, then moving external.
Probably that's true. But even it's going to be weird. It's such an interesting take on things. So I will, yeah. But like we were talking about, I think in some of these previous episodes, obviously what you do with your body is going to affect your mind and vice versa, right?
For sure.
So if you do the yogic stuff physically, rock on, good, right? But then there's the internal part too. Yeah. Okay, so there's this thing they call the imputed nature. And this is the idea of this sense of distinction between subjects and objects, between internal and external. And they use this word imputed, meaning that in our minds, we impute this idea that there's a completely independent external world that's separated from our internal world and is separated from our mind and our shen and our experience of things. We break this apart and we see these two things as like two separate things, two entirely separate things. And they're going to say that that's not true, that split between the internal experiences and the external experiences is like not really there. It's kind of artificial and imputed. Now, what totally that means is the thing, I guess, that you're going to wrestle with when you try to just talk about this. And we're going to do our best stab at trying to talk about this. But the normal way I think they're saying is that the way you experience the world is you think, okay, there's this external world and I have my sensory experiences of it. And there's my internal world and I have my own emotions and thoughts and feelings. And those are two separate things in reality. And they're going to say, no, they're not. And it's even a little bit different even than saying they're interconnected. But I guess we'll try to explore it and see what we think this means to both of us, right? As we try to like wrap our heads around this and share what we can of our own two senses around this. So, but they're saying, no, this is an artificial split. So it's something you call it like, it's like a non-dual kind of way of thinking, but in this very strong way to say, no, there really aren't external objects the way you think there are. And those aren't split off from the internal world the way you think it is. That's not correct. And I think ultimately it's going to go the idea that there's just kind of like one flow happening, which we'll get to when we get to the punchline of the thing. It's kind of building towards that, but that's the idea. And so the big word here is like imputed, that the point of like confusion in this way of talking, ignorance or delusion or whatever, if you want to use more fancy spiritual words, but the whole idea of what's not being seen is this idea that that's an imputed thing, that there isn't this internal external split the way it seems to be. That's kind of a fabrication of our way of experiencing the world. So on some subjective level it's happening, but like when you go deep, it's not really. Now I can say that there's a lot of different attitudes about this. So I study pretty deep. Daniel in his own way too. We all study our own things, but I studied like sort of the presentation of this from Lama Tsongkhapa, who's the founder of the school of the Dalai Lamas. And he is a little critical of this point of view. So not everybody totally agrees with this. So if you hear this and you're like, that doesn't seem right to me, then you'll have good company of other people that will ask questions about this. But for me, this has been a very interesting kind of like little time of like doing our podcast together, because I've like decided, okay, let me take this really seriously, and invest some of myself in it and see what would this feel like to see the world this way.
Sure.
So that's what's been really interesting for me. Let me take the leap and go, okay, true, not true. I'm not even going to debate that point. Right. What would this feel like to think of the world this way, that what I think is internal and external and that division that seems so real to me is imputed. What would that mean? So I guess that's what I'm throwing out, maybe for the two of us talking about it, and then people listening to go like, okay, let's take the plunge in this together a little bit, put our toes in the water, jump in the pool, see what this feels like to do this. I've been doing it myself a little bit, and it has this really, we were talking about like intoxicating ideas, right? Intoxicating ideas. It's a new phrase I like. The ideas that are intoxicating. And it's a kind of intoxicating idea to like play with in your mind. It's like a little bit like playing with this idea of like the verbal ayahuascas of the world, right? You take an idea and it like has it has a power to it that affects your mind kind of deeply. So I that's what I've been trying to do with this. I've been trying to play with this idea in my life since we've been talking about this and investing a little bit more of myself in it. Which is interesting because the school I started off in studying all this stuff was Zen, and Zen's a little like this. So it's kind of a little bit of a flashback for me too. But anyway, so that's the imputed thing. You got anything you want to like throw in about that now, or should I do the next one?
No, we'll wait until we finish the next one.
Okay, so then what they say next is this idea of what they call the perfect nature. And this is this recognition that this subject-object split that we so strongly feel does not really exist. So here's how things are seen to really exist then. On some level, what's happening is there is always this sense of our minds creating our worlds with this split of sensory outside, internal, emotional, conceptual inside. But the idea more like, okay, now we're going to say something different. We're going to say, no, what's going to happen in this way of thought is that there's just one flow, kind of. We'll kind of describe it that way. And in our way of experiencing, our mind's way of experiencing this flow, we experience some things as internal, some things as external, some things as physical objects, some things as mental objects within our own mind spaces. But both these internal and external things are just part of this one underlying flow, which is very hard to see because we're so used to seeing things as internal and external experiences and making these divisions with how we kind of like look at our worlds. So I think that's the best way I can think of to try to describe it. These are just two different aspects of this underlying hidden flow that's going on. And there's a kind of a parallelism, but maybe not even parallelism is the right way to talk about it. But there's this one flow, and depending how it hits us, some of it will appear to be our own internal worlds, and some of it will appear to be this external world. But when we kind of recognize that, no, it's like really part of like one flow.
The supreme source.
That's the perfect nature. The supreme source. Yeah, we did the whole thing on that at some point. Yeah. All right. So to me, if you have the initial reactions, I had some thoughts for myself, which is like kind of talking like, well, how crazy is this idea, for us now? But you have anything you want to talk about first with that? Because we didn't do a lot of prep on this.
No, we didn't. So
this is just like, hey, surprise! Here's this school of thought.
The imputed nature and the perfect nature. I mean, I'm having a hard time differentiating them. First off, they seem identical.
They're more closely related. I mean, there's a flow. So they're emphasizing the idea that there's a flow of cause and effect in the first part.
Yeah, that part
you can kind of see. So I think the reason they talk about that way, so you can recognize cause and effect. And then I think you're right. Then there's this idea like, okay, there's this imputed thing. And then there's this idea of recognizing that, no, it's all part of this one kind of flow of mind or flow of Shen or spirit or something like that. I mean, I guess from what you're saying, the first part emphasizes the idea that there is this causal flow.
Right.
And then some of those things will appear as internal or external objects in that causal flow.
Right. Correct.
Yeah. Something like that. So I think it's an emphasis on the causal flow and how things appear. And then the second part is more the idea that then we split more distinctly. And then the third part is probably to say like, well, we have to unsplit. So maybe that's the reason they talk about it that way. But I hear what you're saying.
Okay, I think that makes a little bit more sense. I'm asking for, just is a little bit of clarification. Being on because I was gone for whatever 8, 9, 10 days.
Yeah, Daniel, before you go, maybe it would be something like if you just said there's a flow, you might not recognize the cause and effect, and you might not recognize the way things seem to appear. And then by the time you get to the third point, you start going, oh, wait a minute, no, this is all part of like one underlying.
Yeah.
universal flow or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were definitely doing is cultivating the sense of focus on the subject, for sure. Which is
retreat.
Yeah, yeah. During the Mahamudra parts and things like this. But during meditation, it's worth doing for people.
So Mahamudra is like, we got the term, and Mahamudra is like a certain kind of deep meditation where you try to, like, without a lot of props and meditative tools, you try to like connect as much as you can to what the underlying nature of reality is or something.
And oftentimes you're open to the external world, but your attention is drawn inward. They'll refer to it as like a passive state. It's like a feminine passive practice, but not passive in that like you're staring into space, not doing anything. You're actually not staring at anything in particular. All of your energy is withdrawn on the inside towards the subject being you. But then also, when you can actually do that, your realization of who you think you are is not the same as the you that you think that you are right now. And even when saying it, it sounds kind of wild, which is why it's difficult to describe, but you're right.
Which is why we're having this conversation as best we can.
You're having
Mahamudra. Maha means great. Mudra means usually like seal. Sometimes you talk about mudras like things you would do with your hands and stuff like that, but that's not the mudra that's being talked about here. This is this idea of like mudra meaning a seal.
Yeah.
A
seal or
not like a seal, like an animal in a zoo or something, or like the ones you see off the pier in San Francisco or something.
Like in this case, I probably more akin to like a family seal for people who know what those are. Like
an emperor seal that they sometimes describe it like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like a stamp.
Like a seal you'd stamp.
Yeah. So a particular state of being that is sort of stamped on your whole body. Like an external manifestation of an energetic state.
Yeah, stamped on the body or stamped on the mind or something.
Right, yeah, stamped on the body or stamped on the mind.
Now, the thing is, like, different people are going to talk about what that means in different ways.
For sure.
You know what I mean? Like, what does Mahamudra mean? But, I mean, there's definitely like a vibe, especially, I think, in the kind of practices you were up to in the past few weeks, that they talk this way. Like the Karma Kargu school, which is one of the Tibetan schools, right? This is how they talk, deep down. They're like a kind of a mind-only yoga experience kind of a place, so they have this vibe about them.
And so we were
fortuitous that we were doing this at this time, I guess.
Yeah. Right? Oh, no, believe me, it's not lost on me. There it is. There it is. Thanks, Uncle Carl.
Thank you, Carl.
And so we were definitely bringing the mind back to the subject, which is just a different state to be in on a. Normally, we're focused on the external world. On most of our time, I call it the discursive mind, right? Problem solving, doing our thing. And then as you bring your mind, sort of back in and out of itself, you get the issue of your default mode network popping up, right? The mind becomes less active and moves more inward. And then all of a sudden your things start popping up.
Which is like the existential guardian operating system.
Exactly.
Or the afflictive consciousness, right? This I maker. Yes. The thing that makes this feeling of I, gives you your sense of your personality, which I think, and I don't know, you've been doing this in the past week intense, but to me, my vibe on this has always been something like when you start looking at your own subjective experience, then you can start noticing these other layers of yourself, including this I maker.
Yep.
Right. You start noticing this default mode network, and you start going, wait a minute, that's a fucking default mode network, and you start to become aware of that for yourself. So you can realize a lot of things by this turning inwards. You can start to realize, oh, these are my patterns. These are my habits. That's the I maker or something, right? You're seeing that experience.
And so for people who are looking for an experience of this wonderfully annoying state, you can simply sit down with no prompt, like turn off all your other things and try and close your eyes and just do some meditation for a little bit of time. You'll find it within the first probably 60 seconds. And,
for sure.
and what is it? Well, it's anything that you have not directly told yourself to do. So if you say, I'm going to sit here and focus on my breathing and do nothing else, anything else that is not you sitting there focusing on your breathing is this thing. And for most people, that's 99%. They're not focusing on their breathing at all. They're not there actually. And so in this case, I can defend the people who say, oh, we should be more present. In that case, yes, I agree, we should be more present. But one of the things that I've really learned now in a deep way, you cannot force external change, or you cannot force internal change by external means exclusively. Like, you have to make the shift on the inside in order to become quote unquote mindful, right? I can't set timers and draw strings on my fingers and have all these things to remind me to do these things. In order for me to actually embody them, I have to do them from the inside out, not only from the outside in. And so, in this way, for people who are looking to kind of like have this experience of your mind popping up, your ego popping up, your default mode network, whatever, sit down, close your eyes, put a timer on for 5 minutes, and see if you can keep yourself just focused on your breath. Good luck.
The thing that was so amazing when I first started doing the Zen stuff, it was just a technique where you would take your breath in, you do a little bit of special yogic breathing stuff that we won't talk about now, all that stuff again. And then you just count your breath on the exhalation. So you just breathe out and you go 1 for the amount of time that you were breathing out.
Yeah.
And it was freaking impossible. Like you'd make it to 3 and be like, well, I just lost it.
What number?
Then you realize, okay,
1.
And you have to start back over at 1, and you can't even make it to 10. It's amazing to find out that your mind is really like that.
Yeah.
And it has all of this stuff going on inside, right? All these thoughts, emotions, sensory things happening. But then I think what they're saying in this line of thought, also this real strong sense of like an independent, like you, this little you or something. And they kind of, in this style of thinking, right? They're kind of saying, oh yeah, you gotta notice that. That's a whole nother level inside of you that you have to become aware of. And then maybe after that, you hit into this feeling of like, oh, I have this huge energetic nature with all this karmic stuff going on within it. That would be the thing that you might think of after that.
Sure.
Because those are those other levels that they add to like a person, right? They say one is this sense of I, talked about this in previous episodes.
Yeah.
And the other would be this sense of like, oh, wait a minute, I'm a huge energetic being with all of this karmic stuff around me, all this karmic energy. Those are 2 other layers of thinking about who you are, right?
Right.
So if you stop and do what you were doing for like whatever week, 10 days or whatever it is, then, I think part of that in this style of doing things in that, let me turn inwards, is that you start to notice these things because they're there.
Yeah.
Yogic experience, meditative experience. You start noticing, oh, wait a minute. I got this little eye maker in me. Huh, interesting. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe there's more to me. I'm like a huge, more sprawling, interconnected, energetic thing than I really thought I was, because these other people do things in the room and I feel what they're feeling inside themselves. I feel other weird shit. I have a much more sprawling, expansive consciousness than I thought I had. Yeah.
One of the things that I definitely picked up, being on retreat, is when we did discussion about the ego, because it's going to come up inherently, right?
Well, that school loves to talk that way.
Oh yeah.
The karma kargu loves it.
Yeah.
So,
and the thing, one of the things that my teacher brought up was that like, your ego is not, it's not the thing that people I think it is, which is why we started this whole conversation whenever it was a month and change ago, that it's not this always like this burden warrior, ruining your plans and telling you you're nasty. And you know what I'm saying? It's not always this negative voice going, bah, 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 bah. No, it's actually not. Once you have some level of practice, even if it's rudimentary, your ego is going to be far more sneaky and far more of a smart monkey than a dumb one. And it's going to tell you very nice things and going to come up with great ideas and fantastic inspiration for you in order to get you to stop looking inward, right? So a friend of mine who, may listen to this, and I mentioned this to her, so if she hears it, we had this conversation, so I'm not outing you right now, what she was meditating and had this inspiration to like share her thoughts in a book and maybe even a speech somewhere. Well, she got out of her meditation, started, writing things down. And then synchronistically, Uncle Carl, one of her patients said, oh, I should get you, I have connections to doing a TED Talk. You should be doing this TED Talk. And so she's like, oh, I should start really writing the speech or something to say. She sat down and guess what came out? Nothing.
Oh, really? Okay.
Writer's block before he even started.
Oh, interesting.
And what did I say to her? Yeah, that's because that wasn't the inspiration that you are looking for. That is your sneaky mind right there.
These are not the droids you're looking for, right? It's trying to fool you.
It's trying, it's saying, it's not going to say you're bad, stop doing this right now, because people who practice, their willpower is much stronger than just to move through those negative voices and continue. But for people who can, who have some level of practice, who are intelligent, which if you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming you have a decent level of intelligence, right? That your mind is not going to go, you don't know what you're doing, stop doing this, no, it's going to give you, hey, I have an idea.
You never know. People get those things. I mean, it does happen that way. But, I'm not trying to argue the deeper point. But, I mean, all kinds of shit happens. It's funny, right?
All kinds of shit happens. I'm just saying, even the good thoughts, even the positive thoughts, the altruistic thoughts, the compassionate thoughts, the things that you should do with your life that are going to help to make it better, do them when you're done. Do them when you're done practicing. Do them when you finish your meditation. Wait till the timer goes off. Ding. Then go do the thing. If it's real inspiration, it'll come to you. But my point is that there are numerous aspects of ourselves that we are unconscious of, and that they will come out once we try to start to move our awareness inwards,
Yeah, again, in this style of doing things, Zen is like this too. This whole idea of hey, look out for this ego thing. It's really a big thing, right? Yeah. Not every school talks this way, but this one certainly does, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I know in the beginning, it's hard. I had to set a timer, and make myself. So if that helps anybody, I mean, you got to do it. Otherwise, you're just well, I think I'm done now, and you get up and you realize, I was only here for 3 minutes.
I guess I got.
Maybe I'm not done. Maybe I could do a little bit longer. So it takes a discipline to do that, and there'll be a part of you be like, okay, I set this for whatever it is, reasonable in the beginning. Everyone's going to adjust to where they're at, but you could set it for 15 minutes or something like that, 10 minutes or whatever you're doing. And you realize there's a part of you that wants to get up and doesn't want to do this. Yeah. Yeah. In the very beginning, it's quite strong. And then of course it grows and grows. And then my other things may happen too. I was thinking about a little anecdote about, I think it was the writer, William Burroughs. So he's kind of a famous beat writer. I want to do an episode about this because I know somebody who knows is one of the top William Burroughs scholars in the world, apparently, and knows all about those beat guys and how they got interested in spirituality and things like that. But anyways, I think Burroughs maybe was even going on a retreat with Gelek Rinpoche or something like that. So Gelek Rinpoche, being, one of the people that Daniel and I had tantric teachings with, right? Mm-hmm. And so his thing was, okay, I'll meditate. I'll bring my notebook and my pencil with me. And if I have an idea, I'll write it down, and so on. And the advice, of course, given was no, don't bring that notebook. Don't write down your cool ideas to write. You do that all the time. This isn't like an exercise for you to come up with more cool stuff to put in your book. Okay, cool. Put it on the side. You can come back to it later. And if, like what you were saying, I mean, you might feel like, well, this is a great idea. I should really have this. It'll come back to you. You won't lose it.
No.
It'll come back to you. You're not going to lose it. You don't have to write it down right now. You really don't, honestly.
No.
If it's really a good idea, it'll stick. Real idea, really good idea, it'll stick. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It'll stick. Yeah.
So Eric, let me just take a second here and think about audience. And so okay, so we have.
Well, I hope you've been thinking about the audience, but
of course I'm thinking about. But I'm thinking about sometimes we're supposed to think about sorry guys, we're going to bring you behind the curtain, if you will. You're supposed to create an avatar of your audience in your mind when you're doing marketing.
Oh, I see. Podcasts. Okay, you're doing that. Okay. You're doing that. Okay, yeah.
Okay, but I'm doing it out loud because I don't give a fuck about that. But
yeah,
I do know people who listen to our episodes. And we just got a really nice email from somebody the other day. And, for people who want to hit us up, don't wait multiple years to do it. Just do it right now, right? ginandtantra@gmail.com. Either Eric or I or both of us will answer. If you want to do a long form email, shorter, you can leave a comment on the YouTube or, in the Instagram. Either way, it's all good. Hit us up. We love to get the feedback, but
we'll take criticism too. I took a really sharp bit of criticism about my commentary on the goddess Kali.
Yeah, no, we'll take anything.
From one listener.
Yeah, that's fine.
You idiot, you moron.
Yeah, that's fine. Sometimes we deserve it,
I'll take it.
But so here's a question.
Thank you, ma'am. I have another.
Here's a question. So and we can both certainly talk about this, but from the audience perspective, all right, so we brought up these ideas of, right, the separate, the sort of boundaries, right?
Uh-huh.
And then what we are highlighting as part of the boundary is this idea of the ego, or the discursive mind, or the default mode network, whatever, the internal thing that pops up when you bring your awareness inward. How do you, as a beginner, we talked about how difficult it was and is, right? How did you and how do you work with this? How does this come, how does this influence your practice?
Which part are you talking about? This thing right here, or like the dealings with the distractive aspects of the mind in the beginning,
the dealings with the distractive aspects of the mind, because that's kind of where we were before, and I wanted to make sure we finished that thread, for people, because we talk about meditation a lot. So
I guess there's like two big lines of thought around this, and I know I play with both of them.
Sure.
One can be the idea that you can be like a person with a sword, and I think you've used this metaphor too.
Yeah.
Where you're cutting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, I had these teachings with Gaelic Rinpoche, and I don't know if I'll do it full justice, but there could be this idea that you could be twirling this sword. And then sometimes, Tibet was like a kind of a warrior culture, Japanese culture is kind of warrior. So sometimes you get kind of warrior imagery. So you're swinging this, you're twirling this sword. And as the arrows come, you of the thoughts, the sword cuts them or something like that. So you can do it like that, I suppose, right? There's also this kind of more idea of like, let the thought go, and it'll be like kind of like releasing it. You're out on a boat and there's a bird, and the bird like takes off. So the mind goes and takes off a little bit, but the bird doesn't have any place else to go because you're in the middle of the ocean. So it'll come back again anyway, something like that. So there's different imagery around this that they kind of use to capture this thing. And in some funny ways, they say even like the mind going and coming back is maybe a more relaxed way of doing things. You constantly twirl a sword can be kind of hard.
Yes.
If you drop the sword for a second, you're going to get hit with the arrow.
Right.
Shoot that poison arrow through my heart. Is that some old 80s song or something? You're going to get the arrow, right? So sometimes it'd be more like maybe in a more relaxed frame of mind that the mind goes and comes back again. Now I know I studied with this doctor from China, Qigong Master Shengli Wang, one of my mentors. Thank you, Master Wang. And we student of him for a number of years medically, and then just in the way he was teaching how to work with the mind and meditation and things like that. And so I think when I was doing this stuff with him, he would say that you could even gently talk to your own mind and just say, hey, I know you're really concerned
yes,
about this issue with this relationship with this person. I know it's really bothering you because you're really in love with this person, and maybe they love you, maybe they don't, and whatever you're going through in your life,
right.
Maybe you're thinking about your kid, well, they might have this issue at school, and that's really bothersome. I don't want them to have this problem. Maybe some other kids are giving them a hard time, whatever you're thinking of. But you can kind of go like, okay, I know that you're very concerned about this, but like we can leave this for a little bit. We can come back to this later. You can in a certain sense, he would say you could talk to your own mind in that way and say, yeah, I get you. This is a legit concern, totally reasonable. I'll get back to you later on that. Let's concentrate on this thing for now. And sometimes your mind will actually listen to you.
Right.
And go like, oh yeah, good point. I can let that go for a little bit, So, yeah, I think there might be multiple ways to do this. And I suppose for me, I've tried to be a little bit like, okay, I'll probably do different things at different times, whatever seems to be the right one to work. I'll try to work with my own mind. There is something you're saying, if you try to force, sometimes it just doesn't work. You're like, I'm going to swing this sword now. But if you're not in the sword swingy state,
right,
it may not work as well. Maybe it's better to let the bird go and come back again. Or maybe it's to have a little convo and say, oh, I know this is really concerning you now. I'll get back to you on this. I promise. I'm not going to leave this concern. Legit concern. I'll come back to you. The other thing I think that happened for me was I developed a fairly decent sense of like, some days you want to do this, some days you don't.
Right.
It's real. So I think to me, when I got it doing Zen in the beginning. I'm not going to lie. I've had it like the entire time. I knew I had to build this because I recognize this quality that it's like this. Some days you're in the zone, some days you're not. Some days you meditate. It's the best feeling you ever had. Some days you go to do your thing, like you're like, I don't want to do this, and whatever. So, but usually when you get going, you'll feel better. I have to say that's the experience too.
Yeah.
But I think the whole thing I was thinking about this just last night. the whole thing about doing, like, for me, I have these Buddhist tantric empowerments, and there's a sort of thing you may call a commitment, which you say you're going to do it every day. And I was like, why do you do that in a way? It's because, sometimes you're not in the mood.
Yeah.
But you make the commitment to do it. And even if it's kind of half-assed and it's like, well, this is a shitty meditation session. I'm not doing a very good job here. That's okay.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the ladies back when I was doing Zen that, she was a very good student of Zen. She had started with her and her husband at the same time, and she just completely outstretched him. She was very good.
Anytime
and he quit.
Female start together, the female always dominates in practice. Oh, it happens every time.
I end up talking about Dean Radin a little bit, but there's a whole thing that, like the statistics of women who are able to like do psychic powers and psi and sensitivity, like they're trouncing the dudes, man.
Guys.
We're getting lapped and trounced.
Sorry, guys. We got to focus more.
Yeah, we got to like focus less or something, change what we're doing. But anyways, he said statistically, it's like that when they do psi research. We had Dean Radin on before. He's a person who researched like psi, like extrasensory kind of stuff or extraordinary powers of the mind. He was a guest on the show. He was really great. Anyways, I was kind of prepping for this episode, listening to his audiobook a little bit. Anyway, so going back to this, there was this lady, and it was one of the most helpful things I heard, in the very beginning parts of this, because she was very experienced. And I don't think she even wanted to teach, but they just said, you should teach because you're getting really good. And your husband quit. So, okay, you don't have to worry about him anymore. Making him look bad. So you can come and teach. She really didn't want to. I mean, I knew her from the retreats and stuff, but she did it. And then she said this very like wise thing, which is like, yeah, days go up and down.
Right.
For all kinds of conditions.
Yeah.
It's a causal flow. It's that dependent nature of things that they were talking about. So some days you're really in the zone. Everything is right. Yeah. Other days, the weather's bad. It's too humid. Your body doesn't feel right. You ate some food yesterday that doesn't feel good. Something's on your mind. Whatever. There's all kinds of shit that can happen. So it goes up and down. Astrological, energetic things. She was talking about that too.
There was
exactly.
My teacher Ane was brought up he has a student of his for many, many years who ended up moving to his monastery in Nepal. And he came for like a year retreat. He's been there 20 years. And he focuses his practices around the cycles of the moon and has been. Yeah. And so there's a multitude of things that can kind of get
talking with someone that I love very, very much. And we were just talking about, the moon moves every day and you feel different.
Yeah.
You move different on each day, Yeah. So those are all true. And she said that, and I was like, oh, because I thought like, well, I'm supposed to get to this same spot every day. It's my job to be just the same every day. Maybe I'm a little bit perfectionistic, potentially. Virgo, it's a problem.
Yeah.
So, the whole idea that I want to be that way, but then to recognize like, no, some of the days, it's not your best day to do this astrologically, physically,
right,
psycho-emotionally, whatever's going on with you, right? It's not always going to be your best day, but you still do this thing, right? And you do it as best you can on that day. And so I also had that idea too. So that's what the things I guess I would say around this.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think, for myself, definitely the idea of the sword cutting for sure is one. And, this is a reference for people like also to take you back to what it is that you're doing, right? So if you have some meditative technique, let's just say it's counting your breath, then that sword cutting is you detaching from whatever thought that you had and just going right back to the order that you have set up for yourself. And you just come right back and right back and right. It doesn't matter what comes up or whatever, you let that go. And that requires some willpower, actually, and maybe even a little bit of energy on some level. So if people are practicing in the morning or at night or whatever, whatever meditation you're doing, even if it's guided, you want to come back to that guide, you have to will yourself back to it. So that's certainly one technique. I do sometimes allow myself to go, okay, what is it? What is it now? Is it your checklist? Do you want to go off your checklist again? Okay, let's go through it. What do you have to do today? You got that. You got that. Okay, you got that thing. Okay, cool. And you got to call that person. Okay, cool. Okay, anything else?
Yeah.
Have it out now. Let's go. and you find that you're like, oh, I want to do it again. So like, I'll allow myself to do that, and then, but after one or two rounds, I'm like, okay, that's it. Now we did it. That's all we can do.
There's nothing's going to be gained from doing this
Not-
again.
Right. We're going to sit here until the
You're
timer
not
goes off.
existentially guarding anything right now.
You're
You're
not
just
doing
being
anything
a bore.
right now. That's it. You're only guarding
Yeah.
yourself at this point. And the other thing I think that I do is sometimes I will give a label to something. So if I'm doing something and I'll say, oh, that's bringing up, if the emotion is present or there's something there, and I could say, oh, that's fear.
Yeah.
Oh, these are fearful thoughts. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, these are exciting thoughts. These are desirous thoughts. And I feel like if I could put a label to this wind, if you will, that kind of comes up, it almost decreases the magnetism that it has, because there's some sort of like unconscious attraction to that force that's sort of pulling you out of your practice, following that thing. Ooh, what was that? What was
sometimes
that?
it's emotions or something. Like sometimes you just realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm having an emotion.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not, it depends on what your relationship is to your thoughts or your emotions or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it'll be like, oh, I didn't realize I had that whole set of emotions. Oh, that's what I'm actually becoming aware of now. And then just knowing that can be very helpful.
And I do find that, like, you put the flashlight on it and it's like, oh, look, there it is. That's that thing there. Okay. And it doesn't like disappear instantaneously, like, oh, I'm free of it now. But it takes the intensity down. It pulls the magnetism down so that you can actually settle back in and practice.
Well, sometimes that idea of just recognizing, and like you're saying, like you have a word for it, you have whatever. I think that does help.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like, and you learn some really weird stuff, like, oh, I thought that was a physical sensation in my body, and I guess it is, but that's actually an emotion. Who knew?
Who knew?
Yeah. So those are moments of insight.
I just thought it was gas.
Yeah, I thought it was just gas paint, and I shouldn't have eaten that extra burrito yesterday.
That's right.
But no. Yeah.
But
Bobby T, Robert Thurman, was interesting on that when he was on the podcast, because I had always heard him of saying, oh God, how should I even try to talk about this? Don't get distracted by the small stuff or something. I kind of heard him having that attitude, but when he was on, I felt like I was setting him up to make that point. And he said the exact opposite. He said, don't belittle your epiphanies. He took it in the opposite direction, and that's an epiphany. To go, oh, wait a minute, I thought that was a pain in my head, but wait a minute, I think it's actually an emotion. Huh.
Yeah.
And
there's a balance, because you can certainly get caught up on every little thing that pops up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's true.
But I think probably the larger, so I gave a couple, you gave a couple. There's more though, right? And to say what's going to work for one person, maybe it'll work for one person, maybe it won't work for another one, maybe it only works for this person one day at that one time, and then they have to do something else. The bigger point is that, like, a person has to become their own kind of engineer on themselves and find some way to be able to make it through. And if it's using
ways,
right? Yeah, multiple, ways. Right? Like every day is a little bit different. Even if Eric has techniques that work for him, sometimes it doesn't work that day. It's, Friday the 23rd, and guess what? Ain't none of that working today. Well, how are you going to figure it out? You have to figure it out, like in some way, or feel your way through, or intuit your way, however you want to put that term.
See, the thing I think that happens with that is, no matter what, you're making some kind of progress in yourself, because even if you're like, this day sucks, and I'm just going to have to gut it through, then you're developing will and determination, and that will help you in some other aspect of your life.
Yes.
There was a guy who came in back in the Zen days too, who had gone through surgeries for like multiple brain tumors. And they brought him in the talk as kind of a long-term Zen student. And he wasn't the guy who was around all the time either. And again, I was in my 20s. I was a young guy. And he came in, and he was an older guy, probably late 50s, early 60s or something like that. And he said, yeah, a lot of these qualities that I developed doing this stuff were the things that got me through these experiences. And I thought about the determination aspect of that. He's like, yeah, I developed determination doing this, and then that determination helped me deal with this health thing.
It's not a small amount of ingenuity, actually.
Well, I mean, using your kinds of things, it's like learning how to program your own internal device.
Yeah, exactly.
You're becoming your own programmer. You don't have to wait for the inheritors of Steve Jobs to like download some shit in you. You can program yourself.
That's exactly. Somebody asked me
yourself.
Somebody asked me where I was, and I was like, oh, I've been gone for 10 days on a meditation retreat. They go, oh, I don't know why people do that. And I said, well, you're changing yourself permanently.
Yeah. fun. Okay, this is like something we could talk about for a long time, but I was listening to something about the spirituality of John Lennon.
Yeah.
Our guest and friend of the show, Miguel Connor, who was on from Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, had an old episode with someone who had written a book on sort of the philosophy and spirituality of John Lennon. So they did an interview. It's really good. So if you want to like check that out, you can just do a search under Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, John Lennon.
That's AEON, right?
Yeah. AEON. So anyways, it was like, like part of the interview was, John Lennon, the Beatles famously went to India to learn how to meditate at some point. And John Lennon got a little bit cynical about some of the, he thought, parts of the spiritual stuff that could be a ripoff. Like some of the guruism, he was like, okay, this is, over the top guruism, which is a fair critique, right? So he had some of those experiences. He was like, nah. But the thing I didn't realize is he meditated for the rest of his life. And at times he would sometimes meditate 6 or 7 hours in a day, or 3 or 4 hours in a day. I was like, I didn't know that. And he's like, took it a little bit out of the spiritual context, though he had spiritual ideas for sure. Different podcasts. I thought maybe we would do one just about, him, because he's an interesting character, but maybe a little on him and George Harrison or something. These people from the Beatles who are really spiritually interested. But in any case, he said something like, it's how you clean your mental palate. And he said it made a big difference for his creativity. Because he was like, you get so bunged up, you can't feel your own creativity. Yeah. And for him as a songwriter, he was like, there's too much crap in there. I got to clear this out. And when I clear it out, the good ideas will come through. So, I mean, you want to say, well, why do you do this? Those are all kinds of reasons why you do this, right?
Yeah.
John Lennon thought about his songwriting. Yeah. One other tiny little point on like concentration. In the tantric world, they do talk about this idea of like you can have mental sinking, which your mind will get very lax.
Yes.
Or mental excitement. Right. And sometimes if you have a lot of mental sinking, you can focus your mind a little bit more up.
Yeah.
So it might be like focusing a little bit more higher in your body or something. If you're doing like a tantric meditation, sometimes you're visualizing something. So you can put your mind more on the upper parts of the visualization. And when your mind is very agitated, sometimes it's better to put your mind more on the lower parts of the visualization. And it has this balancing effect. In Chinese medicine, we would know that as yin and yang, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Chinese culture, you need a little bit more yang, you focus up. You need a little bit more yin, you focus down. And you can start to learn how to adjust your mind maybe that way. So that can be helpful too, and they recommend that technique as well. All right. So there's some stuff.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. I'm glad we did that. I mean, the thing is, like, you are operating your own being for the entirety of your existence. So yeah, this is the most, it's
your own operating system.
It is. And this is the most subtle and powerful part.
That's why, someone like Bob Thurman, Bobby T, talks about this, like learning how to do the inner technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I thought I'd go back just a second or two to wrap up our stuff, because okay. So part of this is like, when you get to this thing about like, it's an underlying flow, and what we're becoming aware of, it's like one flow. Is that a crazy idea for this culture? Before we kind of talked about this other stuff, we were doing that a little bit. And it's a very materialistic culture. And so even to the point where, like in my daughter's assignment, the whole idea is it's your brain that's the only thing that's there, and your mind doesn't even really exist and stuff. It's very materialistic.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that ideas like this are like not like that. They're not these materialistic ideas. These are ideas that are coming from a different place, right? And you're gonna have to like maybe rethink your materiality, as opposed to thinking, okay, the only thing that exists is the real stuff in the material world. We have to think, no, that material world that we see around us is like an energetic flow. Well, in physics, you fucking know that already, actually, which is why I think for some of us who came from these physicsy backgrounds, or, Dan and I were talking about this pre-podcast, who come from these certain parts of the scientific world, you're like, well, of course, this is an energetic flow. What else would it be? Right. But, it also goes back to some of the guests we've had on, like Dean Radin, or we're going to talk about our beloved Uncle Carl again.
Uncle Carl.
Where they're talking about the idea of like, look at what the mind seems at times to do that indicates to you that your mind isn't limited in the way that you think it is. So if you go back and listen to our Dean Radin episode, it's like the idea that my mind is affecting stuff in the reality around me all the time, if I notice it and pay attention. And he gave lots of examples of this. Like one was the example when like Donald Trump won the election back in 2016, all the random number generators that were supposed to be picking up on people's thoughts all freaked out because the whole world went, what? And then, what happens in America influences the whole world. And now this dude's, going to be the most important person, in the whole free world or whatever. So they all were freaking out. That's because people's minds are interacting with the external world in ways that we don't always recognize. Or we tried to have on Rupert Sheldrake. He was initially, his secretary was very nice. And then they were like, what can you do? But, he has the whole idea of the morphic field. You get like a bunch of chimpanzees and one of them learns how to use a tool. I don't know why I did this for the tool, but okay.
I don't know what kind of tool they're learning.
That's a tool he probably already knew how to use since he was a tiny chimpanzee. But
for those who are listening on the audio, he made a very unique gesture.
He did a big kind of a masturbatory gesture for this monkey. Yeah. I don't know why this monkey would need a tool for that. He was born with a tool called the monkey hand.
That's right.
But so anyways, one animal learns a skill, and he, this is kind of like what Rupert Sheldrake is interested in. And then all the monkeys on the island know all of a sudden how to masturbate themselves with that shell. I don't know. That's a bad example.
Yeah, that is a bad one, but it works.
But, he talks about this idea, like, what does your dog know when you're coming home? The dog seems to know before you're there. Why? Because its mind is not limited in the way that we think it is.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of like what this is trying to challenge. And in both of those thinkers, Dean Radin or Rupert Sheldrake, they're making the point that, like, we tend to think of like the material is the ruler, the material is the king of everything.
Right.
But maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's consciousness or the mind that's the queen of everything. Mm-hmm. And it's operating in a different way, and we don't notice it that way. And if you do listen to Dean Radin, he'll eventually say, like, let's flip this whole script around. As opposed to saying it's matter that creates mind, why don't we say the reverse? Why don't we say it's mind that is involved in the creation of matter, which is why you would call this a mind-only school.
Mm-hmm.
Or the person that I thought was really interesting in this would be like Carl Jung, which is, again, why the synchronicity book, which there's an episode at some point, I'm sure we'll do it. Yeah. But he had this idea of like the unus mundus, the one world. Because Jung was really interested in like what happens when you have amazing synchronous events. How could it be that something is going on in my life and then this other magical thing happens in the outside world that matches what's going on in my life? How could that possibly be?
Right.
And a lot of people have these experiences, and we'll do a whole synchronicity episode. We don't have a lot of time for it today, but we probably, a lot of us, if not all of us, have had the experience.
Sure. Like, at least at some points in your life, maybe not every day, but at certain points for sure.
And Jung says, especially when there's really strong emotions involved, you're in love and this happens all the time. You talk with people about this, like, they notice this. Wait a minute, the world is flowing in this other way. And this thing is happening. It's not always even about the person that you're in love with. It could just be like you're in this emotional state and things are flowing in some other way, and you start to notice these things, right?
Yeah.
And it goes along with sort of the research in parapsychology and things like that. But Jung was like, he said, maybe what's really happening is it's one world. There's this flow. And that's why the inside and the outside can match in this way. It's not even like one thing is causing the other. It's just part of a flow. And you become aware of this flow in your internal world and your external world, so it's deep. And so I wanted to share like a little quote because it gets to this kind of like our world too. So I kind of pulled this up. He's talking about this idea, and he says, this could be sort of like nothing less than the restoration of the original state of the cosmos and the divine unconscious of the world. We can see the connection between those two things, our minds and the world outside. And we can understand this kind of in a new way, this fascinating mystery. And then he says, it's the Western equivalent. He's talking about this kind of understanding, right? I'm holding up this synchronicity book again, of like what's said in Chinese philosophy. And I thought this was so interesting because of our backgrounds, Daniel. It is the Western equivalent of the fundamental principle of classic Chinese philosophy, namely the union of yin and yang and Tao. And this just hit me in those words because a lot of times when we talk about yin and yang, we could talk about male and female or, different qualities that you can have, in our stereotypical way, someone says that word, you start going through a list. But part of yin and yang is also internal and external.
Right.
We think of internal and external, and maybe where we have this internal external split, but it's really just a flow of Tao, the underlying flow of energy and nature in the universe. And like, that's what's happening. And that's why we can have sometimes these, parapsychological experiences or why sometimes these extraordinary things seem to happen, because we're picking up on this parallelism that's running. And then he says, he ends the quote with something like, if the mandala symbolism is the psychological equivalent of the one world, this unus mundus, then synchronicity is like part of this, right? Because we're going to experience this synchronicity as we experience this one mandala flow that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's the yogic experience idea, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have to bounce.
I got a minute.
This might, I got one other thing about it, kind of, which is just to say, you know, in this way of thinking, again, no really true internal, external world. We all, like, you know, Dalai Lama talks about this too, and this idea, like, yeah, we all have our own little flow going on, and we're part of this big flow. And I had one little enlightenment story, which was from my favorite Zen poets. And he's supposed to get enlightened when he hears a crow's caw. And I started thinking, what does he experience in that moment? And I suppose if you're EQ, this great poet, you hear the crow and you hear the caw and you hear the experience and you hear you recognize yourself and you realize that that's all just part of like one flow. Right? And it's a very mundane experience. Like we were talking about pre-show. It's a crow cawing.
Right.
It wasn't like he had a vision of like Shiva that appeared from the sky or something. It was the sound of a crow. Or in the Zen school I was talking about, we were kind of joking about before the episode started, but the Zen master who founded the school, Zen master from Japan, had his enlightenment experience when he was like taking a leak and he heard the urine hit against the side of the bowl. What happens in those moments? I think in this way of thinking, it's because you realize the internet connectivity of all these things, that random crow. You realize, wait a minute, that's my mind. This is part of a flow. I'm not separate from this crow and all this stuff. Yeah. So for me, then I think it's just kind of like, it's been worthwhile since we started to go through and do this, just to imagine this, just to imagine like what this would feel like. You know what I mean? And I've been trying to do that in my own practice. Let me imagine like, when I experience this internal and external, it's just part of one flow. And then Tantra, you do imagination. So it's an imagination. Yeah. Right. Make your mind imagine it. Well, anyways, that's my little spiel on it. I want interested in hearing your reactions too, of course.
Well, I think that, like, you know, this is an interesting seed that someone could plant before their meditation, right? And this is a meditation in and of itself, not only to do on like their own particular meditation cushion, but then also in regular life too, and to try to challenge the conventional ideas. And it's not to say that, like, and we never say this is the way. Never. Like, it's always how he said earlier, take it, test it, see if it works for you. So, you know, Eric gives some of his ideas, I give some of my ideas in hopes of, like, you know, spark inspiration in some way for someone else to try their own thing. But, like, you know, truth be told, Eric is following his inner compass. I am following my inner compass. It's led us to some parallel paths. But Eric still does his own thing, his own way, my own, you know, and that comes sometimes juxtaposed to what our teachers might even say, actually. But that's totally fine. Like, the goal here is not to breed more versions of ourselves, actually. At least it's not mine. But the goal is to kind of, like, you know, spark the light of inspiration for someone to do their own inner engineering. You know,
well, when you really think about it, if someone gives a piece of advice that works for you, then you happen to share you both respond to this thing. Yeah. Right. And that's good. So you can learn from other people. You don't have to cut yourself off either. It's like a beautiful dance. Yeah. Right. You learn from others. You see what works. You can share things with others. Things will maybe work for them too. We're all doing this with one another. Right.
And so in this way, then, this particular idea of the external world and the internal world not being separate is one way to challenge a very long-held and steadfast idea of separateness, you know, of the being separate from, of the subject being separate from the object, of me being separate from my environment, of Eric and I being separate beings, and of everybody else having their own, like, little egocentric worlds. And I don't mean egocentric like whoever's listening to this, you're a selfish person. I don't mean that. I mean, as in, like, you are the center of the universe. And technically you are for your own world, you know, but from a grander perspective, we're trying to, like, challenge that viewpoint, you know, coming up to it and say, what if that's not the case? What if that assumption that you've had for your entire life is not true? Maybe it is, but if you've never questioned it, how would you know? You're moving and existing purely on assumption. And we all know what they say about assumptions. I'm not quite sure, but we're supposed to know. We're supposed to know.
I remember the first time I heard that joke, I found it was hysterical.
Right.
It showed up in an old TV show. And I was like, ah,
Yeah.
make an ass of you and me.
Yeah.
It was in a courtroom scene that they did on the old show, The Odd Couple, this really old show.
Oh,
I
geez.
thought it was really funny.
That is an old show.
It was old, even for me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Old. But anyways, yeah. Yeah, I could say it's like I was getting serious into writing this episode. I got serious and like looking at the ideas of this school of thought.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, let me do it. Let me step in a little bit and see what this feels like.
Yeah.
To the extent that I can do it. And I was like, oh yeah, this is doing something. This feels kind of amazing. And then a lot of my other things I would normally do, like if I look at my other meditations I might do for my mandalas and things like that, all got better because I could imagine them being part of this flow. I guess like what Uncle Carl was talking about. And it feels really cool.
I think in a roundabout
intoxicating
way,
thoughts.
In a roundabout way, a lot of practices actually are working to dissolve that barrier anyways, in their own particular way. Like they may not be outwardly saying, or that might not even be the intention per se, but that like through the act of practicing and through the act of like turning your attention inwards and really being mindful of like where your energy is going and then bringing it back in and having insights and subtleties and aha moments and experiences and, working with the mind in this way, I think it occurs on its own a lot of the time, actually. Like, and that's part of the release of, personal expectation. You know what I'm saying? And the release of the feeling of separateness is through this. It's through these realizations that like things are not so clearly.
I think that way that would be talked about because it's just true. So it's like you're recognizing something that's true.
Yes. And
certainly in this attitude, then that's the way it is. You're recognizing something that's already there.
Yes.
Right. You're not creating something new. You're recognizing a reality like, oh, I'm not separate. My creating the idea that I was actually, that was the thing I was creating. This other thing is the thing that's actually true. Okay.
Yeah.
Like that.
So
I would say one last like tiny thing was like, just to give a shout out as I, to Lama Glenn Mullen, beloved teacher. And he says, you could have arguments of different ways of looking at things, but they're all kind of going to the same point. So why argue amongst old schools of thought that might debate each other, 1,000 years ago? That's not the point now. The point is to see how all these things are kind of trying to build to what you're talking about, Danielle, like a set of experiences of seeing the world in a new way that hopefully is more real. Right. Yeah, I agree. All right, we did it. We did it. We promised we were going to do it, mind only, and we did it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, as always, Eric, thank you for joining me on this particular podcast episode and all the other podcast episodes that we've done over the years. Much appreciated, and thank you to our audience, whether you are in the continental U.S. or you're outside in the world. On Earth. And even if you're not on Earth, then, thanks for tuning in. I don't know how you communicate, but like, cool. We appreciate the feedback, like I said earlier. So hit us up, email ginandtantra@gmail.com, Instagram, ginandtantra, YouTube, ginandtantra, leave a like, comment, subscription, all that other stuff. If you find our work interesting, feel free to give us a shout, share our work with people. If you have something in particular that you might like us to cover that is, near and dear to your heart, or you have questions on, please feel free to shout us out. Or simultaneously, if we went over something and you're still kind of like feeling like we didn't do it justice, hit us up, let us know. We'll double back and go deeper on it if that's what people want. Like, we're totally cool doing that. So, feedback is always appreciated. And we'll catch you everybody on the next one. For Eric, this is Daniel. Be well. Peace.